Dust billows as Sawyer Briggs watches the stagecoach disgorge a vision in silk. Not the practical woman his letter promised. Her gloved hand clutches a letter, his letter, but her eyes hold a desperate flicker. "Mr. Briggs, I presume?" Her voice, honeyed and refined, clashes with the chipped paint of his porch. Sawyer's gut clenches. He doesn't know it yet, but his quiet life is over. Sawyer Briggs watched from behind the wooden post of his porch, his callous hands suddenly feeling too rough, his simple clothes too worn. She moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had just endured 3 days of bone-jarring travel across rough terrain. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light in ways that made his chest tighten, and when she turned to survey the modest buildings of his ranch, he caught sight of features so perfectly arranged they seemed crafted by an artist's careful hand. This couldn't be right. The correspondence had described a practical woman seeking a simple life, someone who understood hard work and wouldn't expect luxuries. But everything about Iris Quaid suggested she had never known a day without them. The dress she wore, though travel-stained, was cut from fabric finer than anything sold in the nearby town. Her posture spoke of years spent learning how a lady should carry herself. Even her gloves, now dusty from the journey, were clearly expensive. Sawyer's stomach nodded as a terrible possibility formed in his mind. What if she had gotten on the wrong stagecoach? What if some wealthy gentleman in another territory was waiting for this vision of perfection? While Sawyer was left to explain to his intended bride that she had made a costly mistake, the driver was already unloading her single trunk, a piece of luggage that looked far too elegant for his rough-hewn home. But then Iris Key did something that made Sawyer's breath catch in his throat. She pulled a folded letter from her small purse, glanced at it, then looked directly at the ranch house where he stood watching. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, neither moved. In her gaze, he saw something that contradicted everything her appearance suggested. Behind those striking features was a flicker of something desperate, something that spoke of secrets and circumstances far more complicated than a simple mail-order arrangement. When she finally smiled and began walking toward him, Sawyer realized that whatever had brought this impossibly beautiful woman to his doorstep, it wasn't going to be the quiet, predictable life he had been preparing for. Sawyer forced his legs to move, each step across the dusty yard feeling like a betrayal of his own common sense. Up close, Iris Quaid was even more breathtaking, her skin bearing none of the weathered marks that came from outdoor labor, her hands smooth in a way that spoke of a life spent far from physical work. When she spoke, her voice carried the refined accent of education and privilege. "Mr. Briggs, I presume?" She extended one gloved hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to formal introductions. "I am Iris Quaid. I believe you've been expecting me." Sawyer's throat felt dry as desert sand. "Yes, ma'am. Though I have to say, your letters didn't quite." He gestured helplessly, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like an insult or a confession of his own inadequacy. "Didn't quite prepare you for my appearance?" Iris finished, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I find that written words often fail to capture the full truth of a person. Don't you agree?" There was something in her tone that suggested layers of meaning beyond the simple observation. Sawyer studied her face, searching for clues about what kind of woman would willingly travel hundreds of miles to marry a man she had never met. The longer he looked, the more convinced he became that desperation lurked beneath her composed exterior, like a crack in otherwise flawless porcelain. "Your ranch is exactly as you described," Iris continued, surveying the modest wooden buildings, the simple corral where his horses grazed, the vegetable garden he tended himself. Peaceful, remote, far from the complications of civilized society. The way she emphasized that last phrase made Sawyer's chest tighten with suspicion. Most women seeking mail-order marriages spoke of building a life together, of partnership and shared dreams. Iris Quaid spoke like someone fleeing from something, seeking refuge rather than romance. "Ma'am, I have to ask," Sawyer began, his natural honesty overriding his social awkwardness. "Are you certain you meant to come here? Because if there's been some mistake, if you were supposed to meet someone else, there has been no mistake." Her response was sharp, almost defensive, before she caught herself and softened her tone. "Forgive me. The journey was taxing. I am exactly where I intended to be, Mr. Briggs. But as she spoke, her eyes darted briefly toward the horizon, as if checking to see whether anyone had followed her here. The gesture was so quick that Sawyer might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her so intently, trying to solve the puzzle of her presence. The stagecoach driver finished unloading her trunk and approached them with the practiced efficiency of a man eager to complete his route. That'll be everything, folks. Next stop won't be for another week, so you'd best be sure about your arrangements. He tipped his hat and climbed back onto his seat. As the stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of dust, Iris Quaid watched it disappear with an expression that looked suspiciously like relief. Whatever had brought her to this remote place, Sawyer was beginning to suspect that her reasons had nothing to do with finding a husband. The silence that followed the stagecoach's departure stretched uncomfortably between them. Sawyer found himself acutely aware of every flaw in his appearance and surroundings, from the patch on his work shirt to the weathered boards of his porch that desperately needed fresh paint. Iris stood perfectly still, her composure so complete it seemed rehearsed, as if she had prepared for this exact moment. "Perhaps you could show me where I'll be staying?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I assume you have made appropriate arrangements for a lady's privacy." "Yes, ma'am. I cleared out the back room of the house. It has its own entrance and a good, strong lock." Sawyer hefted her trunk, surprised by its weight. Whatever she had brought with her, it was more than the practical belongings one might expect from a frontier bride. "I've been sleeping in the barn since your letter confirmed you were coming." Something flickered across her features at the mention of the letter, too quick for him to interpret. "That was very considerate of you." As they walked toward the house, Sawyer noticed how carefully she stepped, avoiding the worst of the dust and debris that littered his yard. Her boots, though practical enough for travel, were clearly expensive leather that had never seen hard use. Everything about her spoke of a life of comfort and refinement, making her presence on his struggling ranch seem increasingly impossible. "Mr. Briggs," she said as they reached the porch steps, "I feel I should clarify something about our arrangement. While I appreciate your consideration in providing separate quarters, I hope you understand that I will need time to adjust to this new life. The transition from my previous circumstances has been rather sudden." Previous circumstances. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying hints of something significant left unsaid. Sawyer sat down her trunk and turned to face her fully. "What kind of circumstances were you leaving behind, Miss Quaid?" For the first time since her arrival, her composure cracked slightly. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, where he caught a glimpse of something hidden beneath the high collar of her dress. A necklace, perhaps, or maybe something else entirely. The kind that make a woman reconsider everything she thought she knew about her life, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The kind that make even the most unlikely choices seem reasonable by comparison. Before Sawyer could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. 3 riders were cresting the ridge that marked the edge of his property, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sky. Iris went rigid at the sound, her face draining of color in a way that transformed her from mysterious to genuinely frightened. "Are you expecting visitors?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No, ma'am. Out here, unexpected visitors usually mean trouble." Iris's hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Mr. Briggs, I need you to understand something. Whatever those men might say about me, whatever claims they might make, I'm exactly who I told you I was in my letters. But there are people who would prefer to remember me differently." The writers were close enough now that Sawyer could make out details. Well-dressed men on good horses, the kind who could afford to travel far from civilization when they had business to conduct. The kind who didn't come calling on isolated ranches unless they were looking for something specific. "Just how much trouble did you bring to my doorstep, Miss Quaid?" The 3 riders approached with the measured pace of men who knew their quarry had nowhere to run. Iris's grip on Sawyer's arm tightened, and he could feel the tremor in her fingers, despite her efforts to maintain composure. The lead rider was a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way. His companions flanked him with the easy confidence of hired muscle. "Miss Petton," the silver-haired man called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch. "Or should I say the future Mrs. Petton? You've led us quite a chase." Sawyer felt Iris stiffen beside him at the name, her carefully constructed identity cracking like ice in spring thaw. Peyton, not Quaid. Everything she had told him, every letter they had exchanged had been built on a lie. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, gentlemen," Iris replied, her voice steady, despite the fear Sawyer could sense radiating from her. "My name is Iris Quaid, and I am here to marry Mr. Briggs." The lead writer dismounted with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in the saddle. "Miss Victoria Peyton, your father has been very worried about you. Running away 3 days before your wedding to Charles Hartford was most inconsiderate." Victoria, even her given name had been false. Sawyer felt something cold settle in his stomach as the pieces began falling into place. A wealthy woman fleeing an arranged marriage, using a mail-order bride arrangement as cover for her escape. He had been nothing more than a convenient fiction, a way to disappear from one life and avoid another. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding here," Sawyer said, stepping slightly forward to place himself between Iris and the mounted men. "The lady came here of her own free will to honor an agreement we made through correspondence." The silver-haired man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Briggs, is it? I'm afraid you've been the victim of an elaborate deception. Miss Peyton is engaged to be married to the son of one of the most prominent families in St. Louis. Her father has authorized me to bring her home to fulfill her obligations. And if she refuses," Sawyer asked, though he already suspected the answer, "then we'll be forced to involve the local authorities. You see, when Miss Peyton fled, she took with her certain family heirlooms, valuable items that don't belong to her. That makes this a matter for the law." Iris's hand moved instinctively to her throat again, confirming what Sawyer had suspected. Whatever she wore beneath her collar was worth enough to bring 3 men hundreds of miles into the wilderness to retrieve it. "Mr. Briggs," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of genuine desperation for the first time since her arrival. "I know I've deceived you about my circumstances, but if you have any kindness in your heart, please don't let them take me back." The silver-haired man's patience was clearly wearing thin. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Miss Peyton, but make no mistake, you're coming back with us." Sawyer looked at the woman beside him, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not the mysterious mail-order bride who had captured his imagination, but a frightened young woman caught between impossible choices. Whatever she had done, whatever she had taken, she had risked everything to escape a life she couldn't bear to live. Sawyer's mind raced as he weighed his options. 3 armed men against 1 rancher and a terrified woman were poor odds by any measure. But something in Iris's voice, the raw desperation beneath her composure, stirred something protective in him that overrode common sense. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property," he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "Miss Quaid came here freely, and she's free to stay or go as she chooses." The silver-haired man's expression hardened. "Mr. Briggs, you're making a serious mistake. This woman is a thief and a fugitive from her lawful obligations. Harboring her makes you an accessory to her crimes." "What crime?" Sawyer demanded, running away from a marriage she didn't want. "Last I checked, that wasn't against the law in any territory." One of the mounted men moved his hand closer to the revolver on his hip, the gesture casual but unmistakable. Sawyer kept his own hands visible and steady, knowing that any sudden movement could turn this confrontation deadly. "The jewelry she stole belongs to the Hartford family," the leader continued. "A necklace worth more than your ranch and everything on it. Return it now and we might be willing to overlook your involvement in this affair." Iris stepped closer to Sawyer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body against his arm. Despite everything she had put him through, despite the lies and deception, he found himself oddly comforted by her proximity. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, meant only for his ears. "It was my mother's necklace," she whispered. "Charles Hartford's father demanded it as a part of the marriage contract. It's the only thing I have left of her." The silver-haired man dismounted completely, his patience finally exhausted. "Miss Peyton, you have exactly 1 minute to retrieve that necklace and come with us voluntarily. After that, we'll take whatever measures are necessary." Sawyer felt Iris trembling beside him, her earlier composure completely shattered. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him when she asked for help, or maybe it was his own stubborn refusal to be bullied on his own land. Either way, he stepped fully in front of her, shielding her from the three men. "The lady stays here," he said firmly. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me first." The lead man's hand moved to his own weapon. "That can be arranged, Mr. Briggs, though I suspect you'll find it a short and unpleasant experience." But before anyone could draw, Iris stepped out from behind Sawyer's protection. With trembling fingers, she reached beneath her collar and withdrew a necklace that caught the afternoon light like captured fire. Even from a distance, Sawyer could see that it was extraordinary, the kind of heirloom that represented generations of wealth and history. "This is what you came for," she said, holding it up so all could see. "But understand this. My mother wore this necklace on her wedding day, and her mother before her. It represents love freely given, not sold like cattle at market." The silver-haired man's eyes fixed on the jewelry with obvious satisfaction. "Miss Petton, you're being overly dramatic. Marriage is a business arrangement between families. Love is a luxury few can afford." "Then perhaps," Iris said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "it's time I learned to live without luxury." Before anyone could react, she hurled the necklace as far as she could into the scrub brush beyond the corral. The precious heirloom disappeared into the thorny undergrowth with barely a sound, leaving four men staring in shock at the spot where a fortune had just vanished. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the scrub brush where the necklace had disappeared. The silver-haired man's face transformed from smug confidence to raw fury, his carefully maintained composure cracking like a dam under pressure. "You foolish girl," he snarled, dismounting and taking several steps toward the thorny undergrowth. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That necklace was worth more than most men see in a lifetime." "I know exactly what I've done," Iris replied, her voice steady now, with the conviction of someone who had finally taken control of her own fate. "I've made it impossible for anyone to use my mother's memory as currency in their business arrangements." Sawyer watched the exchange with growing admiration for the woman beside him. Whatever her real name, whatever lies she had told, she had just sacrificed a fortune for the principle of not being bought and sold like livestock. The two mounted men were already scanning the area, calculating how long it would take to search through acres of dense brush and thorns. "You'll spend the rest of the day searching that scrub," Sawyer said quietly. "Maybe longer. And even if you find it, you'll be doing it as trespassers on my land." The leader's hand hovered near his weapon, his anger making him reckless. "Mr. Briggs, you've involved yourself in something that's none of your concern. Miss Petton has obligations that extend far beyond her personal preferences." "Maybe so," Sawyer replied, his own hand moving casually to rest on the rifle leaning against the porch post. "But right now she's under my protection, and I don't take kindly to armed men threatening women on my property." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Four people frozen in a moment that could explode into violence with the slightest provocation. Then one of the mounted men spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of practical experience. "Boss, that brush stretches for miles. Could take us weeks to search it proper, and no guarantee we'd find anything smaller than a saddle. Maybe we should consider other options." The silver-haired man's jaw worked silently as he weighed his choices. Finally, he stepped back toward his horse, his movements stiff with barely controlled rage. "Miss Petton," he said, his voice cold as winter steel, "your father will be most disappointed to learn of your decision. As will Mr. Hartford. They both have long memories and considerable influence. Then they'll have to learn to live with disappointment," Iris replied. "I've certainly had enough practice at it myself." The man mounted his horse with sharp, angry movements. "This isn't over. Your father knows where you are now, and he has resources beyond what you can imagine. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." As the three riders turned to leave, the leader called back over his shoulder, "Mr. Briggs, you might want to consider whether protecting her is worth the trouble it's going to bring to your door." The sound of hoof beat-tats faded into the distance, leaving Sawyer and Iris alone in the gathering dusk. She stood perfectly still, staring at the spot where the necklace had vanished, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked genuinely vulnerable. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I've brought you nothing but trouble, and you don't even know who I really am." Sawyer turned to face the woman who had been Iris Quaid for exactly one afternoon and Victoria Peaton for the rest of her life. In the fading light, her beauty seemed less overwhelming and more human, marked by exhaustion and the weight of decisions that had cost her everything she had once known. "I reckon I know enough," he said quietly. "You're a woman who threw away a fortune rather than be forced into a marriage you didn't want. That tells me more about your character than any name ever could." She looked up at him then, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You don't understand. My father won't give up. Neither will the Hartfords. They'll come back with more men, legal papers, whatever it takes. They'll destroy you for helping me." "Let them try." Sawyer's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had survived droughts, floods, and every other hardship the frontier could offer. "I've been fighting this land for respect every day since I got here. Fighting men won't be much different." "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a breath. "Why would you risk everything for someone who lied to you about who she was?" Sawyer considered the question, his eyes moving to the spot where she had hurled away her inheritance. "Maybe because I've spent enough time alone out here to recognize courage when I see it. And maybe because I know what it's like to feel trapped by other people's expectations." The truth was more complicated than that, but he wasn't ready to examine too closely the way his chest had tightened when she had asked for his protection, or how natural it had felt to step between her and danger. She had arrived as a stranger based on lies, but somehow in the space of a few hours, she had become something more. "What were you trapped by?" she asked, genuine curiosity replacing the fear in her voice. "People thinking I'd never amount to anything because I wasn't born to it," Sawyer replied. "This ranch was scrub land that nobody else wanted. Took me 8 years to make it profitable, and most folks still see a failure when they look at me." Victoria moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her travel-worn dress. "I don't see a failure," she said softly. "I see a man who built something with his own hands and wasn't afraid to stand up to 3 armed men to protect a stranger." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, and Sawyer found himself acutely aware of the way the evening light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. When she reached out to touch his arm, her fingers were warm even through the fabric of his shirt. "If I stay," she said, her voice barely audible, "everything becomes complicated. They'll come back, and when they do, they'll bring trouble that could destroy everything you've built here. And if I go, I'll spend the rest of my life as Charles Hartford's wife, bearing his children and pretending to be grateful for the privilege." Her hand tightened on his arm. "I'll become everything I swore I'd never be." Sawyer covered her hand with his own, surprised by how perfectly it fit against his palm. "Then don't go. It's not that simple." "Maybe it is." He turned to face her fully, seeing past the perfect features to the strength that had carried her hundreds of miles from everything she had ever known. "Maybe sometimes a simple choice is the right one, even when it's not the easy one." But even as he spoke the words, Sawyer could see the doubt in her eyes, the weight of a lifetime spent learning that her choices belonged to other people. The next morning brought unseasonably cold air and the distant sound of approaching riders. Victoria had slept little, spending most of the night staring out the window of her small room, watching for movement on the horizon. When Sawyer knocked on her door, she was already dressed and waiting. "How many?" she asked, joining him on the porch. "More than yesterday," Sawyer replied grimly. "Looks like 6, maybe 7 riders, and they're flying a territorial marshal's flag." Victoria's face went pale. "They've made it official, then. My father must have claimed I stole something worth enough to involve federal authorities. The necklace more than that." Victoria's voice was steady, but Sawyer could see the fear in her eyes. "He'll have claimed I took other things, forged documents. Whatever story serves his purpose. Men like my father don't accept defeat gracefully." The riders crested the rig in formation, their movements disciplined and purposeful. At their head rode a man wearing a marshal's badge, flanked by the silver-haired man from the previous day. Behind them came 5 additional men, all armed and clearly prepared for resistance. "Miss Victoria Peaton," the marshal called out as they approached the house. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of theft and fraud. You need to come with me." Sawyer stepped forward, his hands visible but ready. "Marshal, I'd like to see that warrant, and I'd like to know what jurisdiction you claim over a woman who's committed no crime in this territory." The marshal dismounted and approached with the confidence of a man backed by legal authority. "The warrant is valid in all territories issued by a federal judge in St. Louis. Miss Peaton stands accused of stealing property valued at over $10,000. "What property?" Victoria demanded, stepping out from behind Sawyer despite his attempt to shield her. "The necklace was my mother's, left to me in her will." The silver-haired man smiled coldly. "Not just the necklace, my dear. The bearer bonds you took from your father's safe, the ones worth considerably more than family jewelry." Victoria's face showed genuine confusion. "I took no bonds. I've never even seen the inside of my father's safe." Nevertheless, the marshal continued, "The evidence suggests otherwise. Mr. Peaton has provided documentation showing the bonds were in his possession until the night you disappeared. Their absence was discovered the morning after your departure." Sawyer felt the trap closing around them with the precision of a well-planned ambush. "Convenient timing," he observed, almost like someone wanted to make sure there was legal justification for bringing her back. "Mr. Briggs," the marshal warned, "interfering with a federal arrest is a serious crime. I suggest you step aside." But Victoria was already moving, reaching into her traveling dress to pull out a folded paper. "Marshal, before you arrest me, perhaps you should see this." She handed him a document that Sawyer had never seen before. "It's a letter from my father written 3 months ago, disowning me for refusing to marry Charles Hartford. In it, he specifically states that I will inherit nothing from the family estate and have no claim to any pet and property." The marshal examined the letter carefully, his expression growing troubled. "This appears to be genuine." "It is genuine," Victoria said firmly, "which means I had no access to any family property to steal. The bonds my father claims I took never belonged to me, and I had no opportunity to take them." For the first time since their arrival, uncertainty flickered across the silver-haired man's face. The marshal studied the letter for several long minutes, his weathered face growing more skeptical with each line he read. Finally, he looked up at the silver-haired man with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Thornton, this document raises serious questions about the validity of the charges. If Miss Peaton was legally disowned before her departure, she would have had no access to family property." Thornton's composure finally cracked completely. "Marshal, you don't understand the complexities of this situation. The girl is manipulative, probably forged that letter herself." "The paper is 3 months old," the marshal replied coldly. "The ink has aged naturally and the seal appears authentic. Unless you're suggesting Miss Peaton planned this entire scenario months in advance?" Sawyer watched the exchange with growing satisfaction, finally understanding the full scope of Victoria's intelligence. She hadn't just run away from an unwanted marriage. She had prepared for the inevitable pursuit with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how ruthless her opponents could be. "Marshal," Victoria said quietly, "there's something else you should know. The night before I left St. Louis, I overheard my father and Mr. Hartford discussing their plans to claim I had stolen the bonds. Regardless of whether I actually had, they needed legal justification to force my return, and theft charges provided that justification." "That's a serious accusation, Miss Peaton. It's also the truth. They assumed I would be too frightened to defend myself, too dependent on their protection to risk exposing their deception." Victoria's voice grew stronger with each word. "They underestimated my resolve to live free. Even if that freedom comes with poverty and uncertainty, Thornton made one final desperate attempt to salvage his mission. Marshal, even if the theft charges are questionable, the woman has still violated her legal obligation to fulfill her marriage contract. The Hartford family has significant investments tied to this union. Marriage contracts aren't enforceable by federal law," the marshal replied sharply, "and pursuing false criminal charges to circumvent that fact is itself a federal crime." The confrontation was unraveling faster than Thornton could control. His hired men were growing restless, clearly uncomfortable with the legal complexities that had replaced what they thought would be a simple retrieval operation. Sawyer stepped forward, his hand finding Victoria's with natural ease. "Marshal, if there are no valid charges against Miss Peaton, I'd appreciate it if you'd ask these men to leave my property." The marshal nodded curtly. "Mr. Thornton, you and your associates need to depart immediately, and I suggest you inform Mr. Peyton that any further attempts to pursue false charges will result in federal prosecution." As the writers prepared to leave, Thornton made one last threat. "This isn't over. Miss Peyton, your father has resources you can't imagine. Then he'll have to learn to apply those resources to accepting reality," Victoria replied with quiet dignity. "I am no longer his daughter to command or his property to dispose of as he sees fit." The marshal and his escort departed with professional efficiency, leaving only dust and silence in their wake. Victoria stood perfectly still for several moments, as if she couldn't quite believe that her gamble had succeeded. "How long have you been planning this?" Sawyer asked, genuine admiration in his voice. "Since the day I turned 18 and realized my father intended to trade me like livestock," Victoria replied. "I spent 2 years gathering evidence, saving money, and preparing for the day I would finally have the courage to leave." Sawyer turned to face her fully, seeing not the mysterious mail-order bride who had stepped off the stagecoach, but the remarkable woman who had orchestrated her own liberation with patience and intelligence. "So, what happens now?" he asked. Victoria looked around the ranch that had become her sanctuary, then back at the man who had risked everything to protect her. "Now I discover whether Victoria Peyton can learn to be happy as Mrs. Victoria Briggs, if that offer is still available." Sawyer's answer was to pull her into his arms, finally allowing himself to believe that some gambles were worth taking even when the odds seemed impossible. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the valley, promising rain for the drought-stricken land. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.